Welcome to this Programming User Interfaces lecture. Today we're going to talk about media queries. Media queries are a way for CSS rules to be dependently applied based on different criteria. And so this is really important for us because we'll be using media queries to make a site responsive, for example. And so what basically media queries does is it's able to query the device that the CSS is being rendered on. And because it can query it, it's able to change the rules based on the device limitations or current settings. So basically, it's going to be a way for you to customize your CSS based on the device that is accessing the page. So this is using a kind of slightly different or new way of writing CSS rules. And so it has this @media keyword as the definition that you're defining a media query. And these parentheses there is where you put the specifications of what you want to query. So what aspect of the CSS or the device being used do you want to query? And then of course inside the curly brackets, like normal CSS, you add the rules that you want to apply based if this query is true or not. So for example, if you wanted to have a set of rules that were only in effect if the minimal width of the page was 600 pixels, this is what that query would look like. You'd have this media query min-width, that's the criteria it's testing, and it has to be 600 pixels. And if that's true, then the rules inside of this curly brackets would be applied to the site. And so we're going to be largely looking at media queries to be useful for making sites responsive. But if you check out some of the other things that media queries do, it's a very interesting kind of list of capabilities. So of course, heights around device heights is very useful. But also, if you look at this list of possibilities, there's um, things like hover, right? So does the primary input mechanism allow the user to hover over elements, right? So if you had an interface that was largely based around allowing a user to hover over something to interact with the interface, then you'd probably want to have an alternative to that if the device doesn't support hover interactions. Orientation, which way is the page being rendered, all sorts of stuff. Um, and there's even some more kind of experimental ones that aren't necessarily implemented yet, but could be useful in the future. And so you can even do things like media types where you could define a rule for if the page was going to be rendered on not on a device at all, but actually being printed out on paper. So how should your site look if you're printing it out from a printer as opposed to looking at it on a device? So there's many of these queries that you can do to customize the CSS on your page. But like I was mentioned, we're going to be mostly targeting this max width and min width properties to understand how wide the page is, right? Because if we know how wide the page is, then we can adjust the CSS to display different things on the page to make sure they don't basically crop. So that's basically what you don't want to happen is the page to run off the side of the browser screen, right? Or run off the side of your phone screen. You want everything to flow into the display properly. All right, so um, that's the basic kind of things you can query. So to get started with media queries, we just want to be aware of where we put the rules in our flow of CSS. Because if we put the rules in the wrong place, then they might not be triggered or they might be overwritten by a different a rule that you defined earlier, depending on where it's placed, right? So you always want to make sure that the media query CSS that you're writing appears as the last thing in the CSS rule set. So at the bottom of the style sheet or the last rules if you're doing on an embedded style element in the header of the page. So you just always want to make sure that the media query rules are at the bottom. So for example, in this example, we have an image redefining all the image elements to set display to none. And so that's the default behavior, right? And so since the media query comes after that rule, it will be interpreted, and if the min width is bigger than is at least 600 pixels, then it will turn the images on. And so you can imagine if this was reversed, right? If the image display name was below the media query, then the image would always be off, because the media query, even if it was triggered, the last you know rule, which would be the image CSS rule, which would be below it, is being interpreted, and it's always turning them off regardless if the media query is turning them on. So it's not smart enough to know, like, okay, apply these rules and unapply some other rules. You always have to be very explicit to put the media queries CSS at the bottom of your rule set. There are some kind of general breakpoints when you think about devices, right? So we are using a huge range of devices nowadays, things from very, like 4K, 8K monitors, all the way down to, handheld devices. And so these, you still use pixels to kind of gauge how big a device is and what rule sets should be applied to it. But kind of some general breakpoints to think about are, bigger than 124 is usually going to be like a desktop display, so a laptop monitor, a desktop monitor, and then something less than, or around 430 pixels is probably a mobile device, something with a very much smaller screens. So you could theoretically design your site to work on a whole range of devices based on these resolutions. But it's better to kind of just think of, like, well, what should the site look like on a big device? What should the site look like on a small device? And then those are kind of your bases are covered. So you could go down this rabbit hole of figuring out all sorts of different device resolutions. And so the site that I linked to has actually the various devices resolutions for various specific devices themselves. So, what are all the resolutions for an iPhone and for the different versions of the iPhone, right? And so you could theoretically come in here and custom write CSS rules for specific devices. Um, but that's kind of a losing battle, right? Because there's always new devices and things will change constantly, et cetera, right? So it's a better kind of idea to generally write rules that are kind of vague enough that they apply to um, general use cases. Like I said, something bigger versus something smaller. Um, so this I have some links here that you can use that basically have a good media query setup that lets you quickly kind of get started with these various tiers of sizes for different devices. So let's take a look at one of these. And so this rule set, which is provided, basically covers the gamut of kind of typical sizes, right? So the first one you have is for devices that are desktops. So 128, 1281 pixels and higher, right? And so if you would write your rules here that would apply only to desktop monitors. And then you'd have, you could write rules here for things that are slightly smaller than that. So, not very large displays, but medium-sized displays. And then all the way down to iPads and tablets and smaller devices like smartphones and mobile phones. So, for example, here's, low resolution tablets or mobile phones on, in landscape mode, so they have their phone kind of turned sideways. And also, portrait mode. So, you could even remove some of these CSS rules to say, okay, I'm really only worried about, larger screens and actually smaller screens. And then those are the two things I'm going to be worried about. Okay, so what we can do is try to apply some of these CSS rules to see how they'd be used to make a site responsive. And so, of course, one of the main things that we'd want to do is check out our site that we're building, and make sure that it looks okay in different various devices, right? And so if we head over to our um, site that we were working on last time, the New York Times site that has the CSS applied to it, so we did some CSS work to it. So let's just take a look at the site and see how it looks in various devices. And the browser like Chrome comes built in with some tools that lets us kind of see how the device or the page would look on different devices. So if you inspect, you can come over here and change the mode there's a kind of a toggle device toolbar. And so that changes the device that is being, it simulates the resolution of various devices, right? So here it's selected to an iPhone. So this is what it looked like on iPhone, this is a iPad Pro. And so, that doesn't look too terrible, right? But as soon as you switch it down to one of these smaller devices like a Pixel 2, you start seeing that this is probably not how you'd want the site to be rendered to your visitors, right? This is probably a bad experience to have the site look like this. So you have to kind of triage a problem and be like, okay, well, obviously something has to happen to um, the book cover images, right? They're being cropped, smushed, and that's not how I want to display. And so you can kind of think you've seen this sort of behavior on probably every site you go to. When things get too small, like if you made the site too small, it starts flowing from a kind of a vertical or horizontal layout to a vertical layout, right? So these are the kind of like user kind of flows you think about, or design flows you think about. Like, well, maybe if the device gets too small, then I don't want the various book covers to be displayed vertically. Or horizontally, we'll just stack them vertically one after another, right? And that's kind of like a typical kind of reaction to um, making a site more responsive, to go from a horizontal kind of display to a more vertical display because it's on a smaller, narrower device. So that's a pretty common thing that I'm sure you've seen before. So then for this homepage, then we'd say, okay, we want to do something with these book covers to make them a little bit more responsive and look better on a smaller device. So I'm going to remix this one. And so, since we use Flexbox, this can be pretty simple, but we also want to play around with some of the other uh, kind of CSS settings that we have used already. And maybe we want to change something around those because we have kind of focused when we first did the site, we focused it on just looking okay, just kind of getting the base CSS up there and making it look presentable. And so, we can do this kind of responsive test pretty easily by just making the browser window smaller too. The device view makes it a little bit more legit. It's a little bit more kind of like it takes account for a few other things. But, we can see that this is not the behavior that we want, right? And so, there's sometimes you might not even need to do some sort of media query if you can kind of think about how the CSS works. And so, for example, one of the things that we were looking at was these book covers, right? They kind of smush together. And so, remember we were using this book cover um, like background images for these book covers. And so, you could actually come in here and just play around with this and test the different background sizes that it would display. So we went with a cover set because we wanted it looked the best out of all of them. But we could also change that to contain, and I think we didn't like contain last time because it kind of crops stuff a little bit funny, or it sometimes made things look a little bit worse. But if you have the contain setting, you can see that it just kind of scales to the container, right? So that's pretty good. So we can see that this starts repeating. The background, like wallpaper, keeps repeating. So we can change that to, say, background repeat to none. And so that what that will do is turn off that repeat feature. If it's not none, but no repeats. So when we scroll this, we can see that kind of is pretty good as far as responsive. It gets smaller and smaller. So that's one way of doing it. But we could also think about, we do really want to have this vertical browsing experience because even if it does not run off the side of the page or get extremely cropped, this is still kind of not a very good um, interface, right? It's very small, and we'd much rather have it kind of like vertically blocked. So we can play around with the settings in here without even having to change the CSS yet on the style sheet by looking at the way that the Flexbox is laid out, right? So we used Flexbox originally to do this design, and knowing some of the kind of Flexbox rules, what are available to us, we can think about some approaches to this problem, right? And so if we look at this possibilities, we're going to want to change everything, right? So we're going to want to change the container of the Flex container. So only kind of things on the side, on the left side of the page are going to apply to us. So there's direction, right? So we can control which way the direction of the children appear. So say start, display the last one first or the first one last. But also we can see that you can actually set the column, the layout from row to row reverse to column reverse. And so if you think about what our current layout is, right, it's a row of book covers. So if we could maybe use this property, flex direction, to go from a row display to a column display, that's exactly what we wanted to do, right? So again, before even changing the CSS rules, I can come into here and find our flex container here. So this is a flex container. And we can try changing the flex direction. So currently it is row, right? It's kind of the default one. And if we change it to column, then it switches it to kind of a column display. So if we had this enabled on a column display and the site was this big or smaller, then that's kind of exactly what we'd want it to look like, right? Let's try it in device view. There's some little issues with spacing of text and padding and stuff, but yeah, right? This is much better kind of flow of the content if it's on a smaller device than making them super tiny, right? So let's do that, right? Let's write a rule that says, okay, if you're on a device that's smaller than a certain size, then actually don't display this flex box as a row, display it as a grid. So what we need to do is go back into our code here, and we'll add that to our style sheet, right? So we have our style sheet. So let's, if we inspect the thing we were working on, right, it was called random book cover. That's the container of the book covers. So if we find that in here, here it is, random book cover, and display flex. And so what we want to do, right, is write a CSS rule that switches that, right now it's display, the rule we're using was flex direction column, right? And so right now it's flex direction row. So what we can do is make that the default, right? So we're making just the default rule that will always be the kind of rule when media queries are not being assigned to it. And so, this is the normal way that the page, that the layout is working, so that's fine. And what we can do is now need to write a media query that actually takes into account that the resolution of the page and then applies a different flex direction to that class. And so if we go back into our kind of little starter set here where we had an idea of what should be happening, we could, just for completion's sake, we could kind of take all of these rules and start writing them into our code. And so what we want to do is just make sure that this is happening at the last thing, right? I keep saying this, but it has to happen at the last part of your CSS rules. So I'm going to paste this at the bottom of our CSS style sheet. And so now that we have these CSS media queries defined, we can go in and write in our CSS rules for each one. And so the only CSS rule we have right now is that for this specific flex box container, random book container, and we also use this on the search results page too. So we're kind of fixing it both in one place. So if that's the case, we want to just put those rules that we want to change inside of here, right? And so this is the rules for desktop displays. So we don't need to change anything, right? Because if it's on a desktop display, we still want it to be displayed horizontally. Same for this slightly smaller desktop display, not extra large, but sort of just normal size. And then next one is for tablets and iPads in portrait mode. And so probably keeping it horizontal is still fine for those devices, right? They're still pretty good. And then the next one is smaller things like tablets for iPads uh, and in landscape mode. And so again, those are probably, it's probably still okay to keep it in a horizontal for those. And then we get into these smaller ones where it's in low resolution mobile phones, and then in landscape, and then low resolution in portrait mode. And so for these are the ones we want to change, right? Because these are the ones that we want to go from having it being displayed as a row to having displays as a column. So let's go ahead and switch those from row to column. So these are the last two kind of smallest devices. For most of the devices, it's going to be stay with the horizontal display, and then with the smallest devices, it's going to switch to a column display. So let's take a look if it works. So as I get smaller, at some point it should switch, right? So you can see the resolution up in the corner of the window. It kind of shows you where you're at. So as soon as we hit that around 760 something, 770 rule, which it makes sense, right? Because if we look here, that rule is defined here, 767. So as soon as it gets below that, it switches the rule set to these CSS rules. And so as soon as we get to below a certain size, it switches over to a column-based layout, right? And so that looks way better than if you tried to even just modify the background and have them kind of smushed small into a row. And so by just doing that simple kind of flip of the CSS Flexbox display, it goes from having this really kind of poorly responsive design to a pretty standardized expected response, right? When the screen gets smaller, it goes into a vertical list. And so, the trick to this is understanding the CSS that's being applied, and then figuring out what you need to change to that CSS to get your expected results, right? And so you could have a very kind of, you could do a lot of testing and rewrite those rules just for these book covers, right? So you could say, I know exactly at what point I want them to go from this to this, and maybe it's not the breakpoints we set, but you could define your own breakpoints, right? So it really gives you a lot of power to figure out what you want to do. Another common thing to do is kind of modifying the menu, right? So usually you'll go from like a horizontally defined menu to a vertical menu. And so like let's just play around with that. We won't style it beautifully, but we'll just see what CSS rules we need to change for that to happen, right? So in this case, we don't really have that problem because we only have two menu items, but most sites would have a lot of menu items, right? Or at least a few. So if we had a number of these menu items here at the top. So what happens when you start scrolling or it gets smaller, right? It starts stacking up like this. And so maybe that's not the particular result you'd want to happen, right? Maybe you want it to go from like a, a clean break from like a horizontal layout to a purely vertical layout. And so what we would just need to do, right, is figure out what needs to change from these and stop trying to smush in horizontally to going straight vertical. And so of course we can inspect these elements and play around with them in the browser before we make the rules. And so if you remember these list items, there were list items that had a link inside of them. And I think we played around with the list item itself, right? Yeah, so we have a rule specifically saying that these list items should be displayed inline block. And so that makes them display in the same kind of inline pattern, not taking their own div block or not taking their own hard break and making their own element. So if we toggle this property, right, we can see that it goes kind of more towards what we want it to be, right? And so we basically would have to say like, okay, well, if it gets to a certain size, then we want to change the nav li elements from displaying inline block to being displayed as maybe just block, right? And then we'd probably say, okay, and we want to add some padding, maybe more padding, maybe not as much padding. Um, let's see if we add margin auto, what happens? Not much. All right. So I think that's like kind of like a good start. Um, maybe we would want to add a text align center, right? So if it gets to a certain size, then it would be, the screen itself would be much smaller, so then it would be more centered and it wouldn't look so funny. So these are some pretty good rules. Let's apply these to our CSS media query. And so remember, this is the nav li that we're working with. So if we go back to our code, we can see that the nav li, just have to find it here. Here's the rule, nav li display inline block. And so all we would need to do is we can reuse these same breaks, these media query breaks, because they are they apply regardless, whatever rules are in them. So we could reuse these media breaks to say, okay, well, um, let's copy it. And for the first one, which are large devices, we'll keep the same rule, right? So we'll have two options here. In one case, it'll be display inline block. In the next case, for the smaller devices, it will be displayed as a block with some padding and some extra stuff, some text line stuff. So we just need to go through and decide which of these, at which breakpoints we want these different rules to apply, right? So for definitely for the smallest devices, we want this change to happen. And definitely for the second tier smallest devices. And then, you just need to kind of experiment and see how it works, and is it working how you want your experience to be, right? So once we get to a certain size, it switches over to vertical. So you might want to add it, to a couple different ones, or higher breakpoints to do it at an earlier, lower resolution. But I think this is kind of like a good demonstration, or at least a good start, right? So you might even want to change this even more, right? Like make these buttons bigger because you're on a mobile device, so you don't want to click very small areas. You might want to make it fill up the whole area and make it a larger button. You might want to do things, some other things, like make them, different colors, or maybe even make it toggleable, right? So this is a kind of ubiquitous design pattern where you have like the hamburger or the kebab little icon, so that that you can display the menu or hide the menu. Because you might always want to display the menu on a big device, but have the user toggle it if it's on a smaller device. So there's a whole range of things you can do, right? But basically, the keys to this is first figuring out what CSS elements need to change in order for the design to get into a more responsive layout, and then simply figuring out where in the breakpoint sequence you want that to happen. And once you have those two things together, then the site becomes very much more responsive and very kind of much better user experience. So hopefully taking a look at those two things should get you some ideas and get you started on applying these responsive rules to your own site.